All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Brian Reed. I'm a senior fellow at Tufts Seaver, and I write a newsletter called Cost Curve. We're here to talk about 340B, and before I get into the meat of things, before we introduce our speakers, I wanted to thank Reuters Events for hosting us, as well as the J&J Center for Healthcare Policy Research for sponsoring Reuters Events in promoting and facilitating today's session, which is going to be part of a broader series of webinars on policy research. I also want to underscore that our panelists are participating as independent thought leaders, which means that they're sharing their own research and perspectives, and that may not necessarily reflect those of their organizations, sponsors, organizers, other groups that they're affiliated with, unless otherwise stated. A recording of this session will be made available by Reuters Events to all of you who have registered. So today we're going to talk about who benefits from the 340B boom and who pays for it. And I'm going to dispense with a lot of the usual organ music about what 340B is. You are all registered for a 340B webinar. You know that 340B sales are over $80 billion at the discounted rate. That's growing at 20+% a year. And this is money that's flowing largely to the large nonprofit hospitals. Where we want to go deeper today is looking at who's capturing that benefit, whether that aligns with what 340B is supposed to be about, and what the broader consequences are across the healthcare system. And we're really fortunate because I think we have the exact right trio to talk about these problems. So we've got Neil Massia, who runs Health Capital Group. They conduct strategy and policy research, and Neil is just back from the ISPOR conference in Philadelphia, where he assures me that 340B was very, very much a part of that dialogue. Saya Nikpe is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. She's been studying the way we finance the healthcare safety net, where some of those holes are, and educating policymakers on what to do with it. This was great timing. We had no idea when he pulled this together, but Saya just published what is going to be an incredibly highly cited, definitive project on the prehistory of 340B. Everything that happened, leading up to in 1992, this law going on the books. And then Sean Greminger is the president and CEO of the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions. And I think he's been the clearest voice on how 340B impacts employers. And I think it's important to get that perspective as well, because this is often a program that is promoted as something where the interests of providers and manufacturers have to be balanced. And Sean, I think, brings in the idea that this is actually much more broad in terms of the impact on the healthcare system. So with that, in terms of introductions, I want to start by kicking it to Neil, because Neil, you published 3 analyses in the last year that I really think tell an interesting story about, again, who benefits and where that benefit comes from. Can you give a brief overview to kind
Yeah.
of set us on a data foundation before we get too deep?
Thank you, Brian, and thanks to Reuters for having us. This will be fun. So before the jokes and banter begin, because we all know each other well, I think it would be very helpful to ground this in a little bit of research. I'm certainly not the only one out there doing research on 340B, but when I started publishing, I was really interested in the simple connection between, just our hospitals. Well, what are they doing with the money? Clearly, there's a discount provided by the drug companies, and presumably it's mostly winding up with the hospitals, and then they do stuff with it. That's the nature of the program. What I have found, like many others, is that it's hard to find evidence that there's a big difference, for example, in charitable care or other areas, that after you control for hospital characteristics carefully in a regression, it's very hard to see how those benefits are flowing out to patients. And so then I started to wonder, well, like, what else is going on with 340B? And it turns out that the last few papers I've done have really focused on the hospital, how the hospitals try to optimize their way through 340B in terms of finding the patients to sell 340B drugs to and earn a profit from. So it turns out that it's really quite heavily dominated by large hospitals. Clearly, little hospitals, rural hospitals especially, it's become a real lifeline for them, and I can see that in my research as well. But all of the structural growth in the program seems driven by large hospitals and teaching hospitals. And so I've been putting out work that just measures that. And I think it's pretty uncontroversial from a methodological standpoint. You just have to count up who's growing and by how much. And you do that by looking at child sites, by contract pharmacy relationships, by the growth in those things over time. Um, where do they put those child sites? So we put a paper into Health Affairs Scholar last year showing that the sites tend to go into high income, well insured areas, which is kind of the opposite of where you would want the treatment benefits to go. That's because that's where the well-insured patients are, and of course, those are the profit generators for the program. Um, we have research that'll be coming out soon around the links between consolidation on the hospital side and 340B, and it turns out that after consolidation, hospitals become more likely to join 340B. And why is that? It's because they can sort of engineer their way to eligibility. Um, and in addition to all that, when you get down the road toward consolidation, we've been able to see things like 340B linking to higher ACA premiums. And that was published also, I think, in inquiry, I think. 340B linking to higher employer premiums, so on and so forth. So the whole ecosystem is now affected by the incentives in the 340B program. And I think it's fair to say that uh, it permeates through everything from employers to Medicaid to Medicare costs, and we've seen those trajectories only growing, and so that's really where my research has been focused.
I mean, that feels like a good, again, this is a good foundation for talking about like, okay, where do the benefits accrue? I'm going to pause right now and actually say, we've got a lot of folks in the audience here. We will take questions, time permitting, at the end, but as you have them, stick them in the chat and we'll either work them in or we'll knock them all out at the end. But Neil, what you seem to be describing is a world in which essentially the big get bigger, that this is a program kind of that is I wanted to say by and for kind of large hospitals, and there's a lot of engineering to make sure if you're large and sophisticated, you're capturing as much of this value as possible. But this is actually exactly what Saya's new paper is about, and I want to get your perspective, Saya. Like, who was 340B intended for? And from what you've seen, and you've done some work on this, and from Neil's work, are we hitting the mark that was set in 1990, 1991, 1992?
Yeah, I would say that we're not. So I just concluded this project. We interviewed almost 20 different stakeholders who were around in the 1990s, people in the Bush administration, in key, staffers on key congressional committees, lobbyists, advocates. And what we learned pretty quickly is that even though 340B is seen as this like fait accompli, it is something that hospitals rely on, that those big hospitals like build strategy around, and it's for hospitals. What we learned is that actually 340B was born almost by accident to solve a different problem. It was meant to be a quick, narrow, technical fix to address an unintended consequence of a policy that was created in 1990, the Medicaid drug rebate program. So if you're familiar with Medicaid drug rebates, that program essentially passed best prices. The best price that's out there in the market for each manufacturer for each drug needed to be passed through to Medicaid in the form of a rebate. And what was happening was, I think policymakers thought that those best prices were going to private payers. It turns out that, or private purchasers, it turns out that a lot of those best prices were being won by the VA. They were being won by Public Health Service Act clinics. So think about, federally qualified health centers, Title 10 clinics, places that really have a safety net mission. They're reliant on, federal appropriations for their budgets. Back in the day, they had very few privately insured patients. And also they had a hard-coded requirement to provide care for free or at a heavy discount. And so what happened is Medicaid drug rebate program entered, all those best prices disappeared almost overnight. Within a year, they were gone. There were enormous price increases on these little clinics, and they had fixed budgets. So, they couldn't provide the care that they were providing. We saw testimony from, drug treatment clinics that all of a sudden, they couldn't they couldn't reach, 20 or 30 or 40 new patients each year because now they were spending 3 or 4 times what they were previously spending just on drugs. And so this was a policy meant to help those small clinics continue doing what they do, providing safety net care. Now, what ended up happening is after, it took a while for the policy to mature. It took about a year and a half for it to gain speed. Eventually, policymakers decided that, actually it probably makes sense to put public hospitals in this bucket too, even though they're not funded by the federal government. They are core safety net providers and they provide care to all who enter with this requirement, usually to give out free or discounted care. They're providers of last resorts. And so they got added to the program as well. But what we learned is that in the process of, making this policy, getting it over the finish line, compromises had to be made. And that is how we sort of see the introduction of the modern criteria that we have. In fact, this eligibility criterion that we all know of today for DISH hospitals, you have to have a adjusted DISH patient percentage greater than 11.75%. That cutoff point comes from deals that were made to qualify two specific hospitals to satisfy two ranking member legislators at the time. So it really, it was really a program that was focused on solving a problem for core safety net providers of last resort. And because of some other accidents of history and sort of reinterpretation of the rules, we now have this program that is kind of flipped on its head. And really, the nonprofit hospitals are the biggest beneficiaries of this program.
No, it's interesting because you're on both sides of this historical piece. So now you've gone back and looked at why we got in this position, in the first place, and you've also been involved in Minnesota's effort to really define. So based on, Minnesota's now done two transparency reports. You guys are out ahead on this. So who benefits? So what kind of hospitals? Again, we saw the kind of hospitals that were supposed to benefit way back in the day. Who's benefiting now and leaving the value judgment about whether or not that's good or bad?
Yeah. So basically, I have to shout out to my state because Minnesota really did a really amazing thing by creating this transparency report. Now a bunch of states have followed suit. The federal government hasn't acted, so really states are the frontier of transparency, which I think has been a really vital element to program reform and really trying to make sure that those core safety net providers benefit because they aren't as you said, they're not the primary beneficiaries right now. So last year, what the report found is that hospitals and, looking at all covered entities in Minnesota, they accepted, I believe it was about $3 billion in reimbursements from payers and patients for drugs that were purchased at a cost of about $1.5 billion. And when you net out around $200 million in, fees, things like that are, you could say, okay, fine, those are operational costs. You end up with this spread, which the report calls 340B net revenue of $1.34 billion. Now, 80% of that is generated by hospitals of all stripes. So both those really big DISH hospitals, as well as all of those little critical access hospitals, some of the other smaller designations. But when you really focus on the DISH hospitals, that is where I believe it's almost 95% of that 1.34 billion is coming from. I think they alone are north of $1 billion in net 340B revenue. So it really is primarily the benefits of this program are primarily accruing to hospitals. When you look at the grantees, what you find is, so think about FQHCs, your Ryan White clinics, about half of them really just break even on this program. So this program is primarily benefiting them by lowering their losses. And because they have some privately insured patients or Medicaid patients, they do generate, a little bit of net revenue, but it is a completely different game for the grantees than it is for the nonprofit hospitals.
And I mean, Neil, can you riff off this a little bit? Because I mean, you look
Yeah.
specifically at, who is that's, when we talk about big hospitals, who are we talking about, and what gradations can we make here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, and by the way, it's not limited to the hospitals. The grantees also have sort of a size, a big difference in terms of size. There's some really, so I had no doubt about half the grantees, breaking it. But again, just as with hospitals, there's some really large players on the grantee side that tend to dominate that side of it, albeit clearly this is mostly hospitals. Within the hospital universe, you can just think of your favorite large teaching hospital, large teaching system. I won't call them out by one, but what they tend to have in common is at a minimum healthy operating margins year to year. So those could be 5, 10, 15%, as measured in the cost reports. You can quibble about what is the best way to measure a hospital operating margin. But they're clearly very healthy, very growing, very dominant systems that are lots of times buying other systems and engineering around that. They really do dominate the growth. The vast majority now, and that is accelerating. So I just had a poster actually at ISPOR this week about that, where the growth in the program over the last, let's say, 5 years is just increasingly dominated by large teaching systems and large hospital systems generally. Um, the smaller hospitals, the rural hospitals, the critical access hospitals, to Saya's point, often are at a disadvantage, for example, when negotiating their contract pharmacy relationships in the first place. So they're just not going to make as much money off of the kind of spread that you can get. And then they don't have the patient volumes the way a big hospital just has tendrils. And I'm sure Sean is licking his chops to talk about that. If you're sitting in a large employer plan and you ever got an X-ray at a at a clinic owned by, your favorite local large academic medical center, suddenly you're kind of fair game, and you're going to get picked up by these very sophisticated networks of pharmacies slash large hospital systems. And you're an unwitting participant in this program. That's the only way you can get to 150 to $200 billion of reimbursed value, is if everybody's in the pool. And so, that's really what we're seeing.
Sean actually has been very patient. And I promised in the intro that like this is often framed as this conflict between manufacturers and providers, and those are really the only people that matter, and that's obviously wrong. But I think we just played into that. So I'm gonna pivot to Sean. So when we see 340B grow and grow specifically in this way, what are those knock-on effects on employers?
It, thank you very much, Brian. And I was very patient. I'm rarely do I wait this long to hop in on a 340B conversation. I want to answer your question, and I also actually want to go back to some specific findings from the Minnesota report, because it's so indicative of what we think is probably happening nationwide. Um, so, in, yes, manufacturers are having to sell drugs at a price lower than they would otherwise like to sell them, right? So there's no question that manufacturers are substantially impacted. And that is what it is. I'm not too personally worried about it, but I understand why they're upset about 340B pricing. And there's no question it has impacts on sort of their profitability and arguably, their ability to engage in R&D, et cetera, right? I also think there's a reasonable chance that manufacturers are pricing in 340B into the way that they price their drugs. They'd be crazy if they weren't. So there's almost no question that at least some list price increase is a product of 340B. But putting that aside, the other big people, a big section of the economy that is impacted by 340B is employers, purchasers, and by extension, working families. And that happens in a number of ways, some of which are easy to calculate, some of which are harder to calculate. So the easy to calculate one, relatively easy to calculate, is lost discounts that we would otherwise get if the drug was purchased through the traditional drug channel through our PBM. So I hate using the term rebates because I think rebates are dumb, but the way that we price drugs in the United States in most places is there's a list price of a drug, and then there is a rebate offered on that drug to get you to a new net price, right? It's more complicated than that, but that's basically what it is. So the price that an employer will pay for drugs tends to be the price of the drug net of rebates. When a drug is sold under 340B, per the contract between the drug manufacturer and the PBM, the manufacturer says, look, I have to sell this drug at a 50% discount, sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less. I cannot afford to pay a rebate on that drug, right? I'm not going to do it. And I think that's understandable, right? You can't expect a drug maker to literally be underwater on a lot of drugs, which they would be if they were stacking both the rebate and the 340B discount, which means there's no rebate for us, which means when the drug is sold, ultimately purchased by the employer on behalf of their covered lives, we're paying the full price of the drug, right? The kind of highly inflated, crazy full price of drugs is paid for by self-funded and fully insured employers and purchasers. That means our premiums go up. That means our out-of-pocket costs go up. That means ultimately that wages are reduced, right? Like 340B is ultimately a way for hospitals to capture margin, which means we are paying more. I mean, it's sort of a one-to-one correspondence here. The net effect of that, the most recent survey or study on this looks like we're losing about $6 billion in rebates, or a better way to think about it, I think, is that employers are paying $6 billion more for drugs than they otherwise would. But that's only the first part, and actually the smaller part of kind of the other knock-on effects. So the secondary impacts are a lot of the things that Cyan and Neil have already talked about. 340B helps to drive consolidation. There's very strong evidence on this point, particularly in the oncology space, where a lot of the money is made by sort of the drug price markups. 340B covered entities tend to prescribe more expensive drugs than non-340B covered entities. They have a profound profit motivation to do that, right? If you can buy an expensive drug, have a huge 340B discount, and sell it at the expensive price, that is better for you than having a lower price drug that ultimately the patient pays for. They tend to prescribe more drugs than non-340B, similar non-340B entities, and they tend to mark up the price of their drugs even more, which is a little bit crazy when you think about it, because hospitals already are able to engage in what we call buy and bill, where they buy the drug at whatever they buy it for. If it wasn't 340B, they'll buy it through their GPO, and then they mark it up to sort of whatever they think they can get from the commercial plan. Interestingly, the hospitals that are buying at an even lower price through 340B than their non-340B competitors, their markups tend to be even higher, which is, I think, remarkable in and of itself. So we asked a really smart researcher named Neil Meja, who you may have heard of, whether we could calculate the impacts of of all of those sorts of things. And Neil's answer was not really. I mean, like, yes, but not in a quite as direct a way. Like, what percentage of consolidation is caused by 340B? That's really hard to figure out. It gets to sort of the motivation of like what's going on in the hospital executive's mind. Why am I buying this place? Is it because I just want more market share, because I want the 340B discount or whatever? But what Neil did, and in a report that was published in the National Alliance on the National Alliance brand, is looked at the difference in price in the commercial side between large 340B hospitals. I think we took out, Neil can correct me on any of this stuff. We took out rural hospitals and sort of smaller hospitals, and we looked at large 340B hospitals versus similarly situated large non-340B hospitals. And what we found was that 340B hospitals were, I believe, 7% more expensive across the board. That's not just for drugs, right? That's for everything. That's for all goods and services. 7% more expensive than non-340B and 25% more expensive on the outpatient side, which of course is where 340B drugs are. If you take all of that, you look at it across the country, what is the impact of that price differential? For employers and purchasers, it's huge. It's over $30 billion a year. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim that all 30 billion of those dollars were uniquely because of 340B, but the correlation is very clear and very strong. And that's why, we have gotten so involved in recommending and arguing for 340B changes, because in the end, it is not just a shift away from manufacturers towards hospitals. If it was just that, I would probably say like, good luck, not my problem. It is in fact a substantial tax on employers, purchasers, and working families. And if the money was being used in a way where it sort of met the social contract, I would think about whether we could support something like that. I think the unfortunate reality is that it's not.
So this is not the only place where the 340B program is kind of diverting or short-circuiting other existing systems. And you've written that this similar phenomenon is happening in Medicaid, although not universally. Can you hum a few bars on that?
Yeah, let me first say that just double down on what Sean said, which is that, in Minnesota, it's about half of that $1.34 billion in what they call net revenue, that spread that's coming from commercial payers. So it really matters. And another thing I'd just love to add is, Sean mentioned the dynamic of selecting more expensive treatments. One of the things that Minnesota's report does is it asks hospitals to report on, I think, their 50 highest volume 340B purchased drugs. And what we end up seeing in the report is that Humira, adalimumab, I never say that correctly, is one of the top drugs, which we know to be in penny pricing. If you don't know what penny pricing is, penny pricing means that the statutory formula that determines the 340B discount has grown to be so big that it forces the price, the 340B price, to be 1 penny so as not to become a negative price. And so for that reason, it really speaks to Sean's point that people are still choosing these kind of more expensive treatments, even when there are biosimilars available, for example. Now, to the point about Medicaid, this is a topic I really care about, and I was sort of shocked to learn this, but when I first started studying 340B, it's a well-known feature of 340B that you may not have duplicate discounts, right? I mentioned the Medicaid drug rebate program. That is what 340B was created to respond to. And for many, many years, there was guidance saying, essentially preferencing Medicaid drug rebates over 340B discounts. So if a patient who is covered by Medicaid walks into a 340B provider's, clinic, Medicaid gets the prerogative of the rebate, and you have to hold off 340B. What I learned, though, from talking to legislators here in Minnesota is that over time, the regulatory protections for the Medicaid drug rebate program have sort of eroded. And what we have now is a situation in which covered entities, kind of leveraged by the way that Medicaid managed care works, they can sort of use the timing of the 340B discount to kind of take a discount ahead of time. And then when the transaction finally reaches the Medicaid pharmacy director, he or she will note that, oh, a discount has already been used. Therefore, because of the duplicate discount provision, I cannot take a Medicaid drug rebate. And that raises costs on states as well, by quite a bit. It is a channel that was not fully appreciated. And one of the things when I present on 340B, typically people say, it's a program that doesn't affect taxpayers. It doesn't raise costs on taxpayers. And this is a pretty tangible example of how that reasoning is false. Medicaid is paid for by state and federal government. State taxpayers and all of us in contributing to our federal taxes are paying for Medicaid that is an entitlement, and so we are all paying more for those services because of this interaction.
I would add it's not just
Okay,
Medicaid,
go
but
for it.
also states are very large purchasers in the commercial market as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
States employ a lot of people and they have the same impacts that we see with any other employer.
Yeah.
So I want to step back and not step back, step forward and pivot towards solutions. So it's the easiest game in the world to play is talking about 340B and unintended consequences and misaligned incentives. That's easy. What's harder is figuring out where to go with this. And I want to start by kind of asking about the potential and limits of transparency. So obviously Minnesota was a leader here. Other states have adopted this as an approach. How far can that take us? And I know this is naturally a question for Saya, but I want to start actually with Sean, because I feel like you have defined best kind of the harms. Is transparency a solution to the problems you have? And then I'll let Saya respond to that.
It's probably the best near-term solution, right? Solution is not the right word. I think it's probably the best near-term policy that we can expect. Um, Transparency at the sort of public level makes a difference, right? What Minnesota is doing, I think, is helping to really expose the problems and make a case for why we need reform. I think we need more of that. Jason Smith, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, proposed legislation that got knocked back by the hospitals, I think, earlier this week that would have required sort of similar kind of reporting requirements at the federal level. So we think that sort of broader understanding of what's going on in 340B will then help build the case for more meaningful reform. I also think transparency is really critical at the plan sponsor level, and similarly for all of the other stakeholders. So I don't think we want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but one of the crazy things about 340B is that despite being an $80 billion plus program, depending on how you want to count it, and growing at 20% a year, no one really knows, other than maybe the covered entity themselves, which drugs are sold under 340B and which ones are not. There is a claims modifier that is used, but it's used sparingly. And often the PBMs involved and the plan sponsors who are purchasing drugs through a PBM are actually taking best guesses as to whether a drug was sold under 340B or not. One of the questions I get all the time, and we've done a calculator based on part of Neil's research on like how much is 340B impacting individual employers, but it's all very much estimates. Employers will ask like, okay, how many of my patients are getting their drugs filled through 340B? How much am I losing in rebates? How much more am I paying in drugs? And the answer is we don't know, right? PBMs, we have an idea of how to get there, but like they're still playing guessing games. One of the things that we strongly support is efforts underway, whether it's through what's called the rebate model, which is something that HRSA is working on, or maybe sort of through a neutral claims clearinghouse, which has been proposed by others, that we need to have a clear 340B claims modifier. Every drug that is sold under 340B would have that claims modifier. We would know what the price was paid for the drug, and then that would be shared with plan sponsors. So we would finally have an idea of like what is going on. And then with that, we would actually be able to make plan decisions, right? So again, without getting too far into details on like ERISA law and the ability of employers to do stuff, an employer with that information could say, okay, I see that I am paying way overpaying for my oncology drugs at this particular practice because it turns out it's a 340B covered entity child site. I'm going to redirect and try to send more of my people to this practice over here, which is not a 340B child site, in which I'm going to be paying the negotiated price for the drug rather than the list price for the drug. But it's hard to do that without really knowing what's going on. So we think that sort of transparency at the level of the stakeholders involved is really critical to starting to get a handle on this program.
Yeah, I mean, for my perspective on transparency, I completely agree with everything Sean said, but I think that the patients deserve to know if they're, you know, in the program. And if so, what are they getting for being in the program? You know, what's happening? So I don't pretend to know everything about how the point of sale sort of process works, because every time I go get my own prescriptions, I have no idea what they're going to cost, and I have no idea how to explain what they cost. But I think that there's a need for patients to engage on this issue if they are the ones, in fact, generating the discounts or generating the profit opportunity for having purchased that discounted drug. And so I think any effort in this transparency game's gotta go all the way to the patient level, and to make sure the patients are benefiting if they're being used as a source of profit for whatever entity they're affiliated with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with both what Sean and Neil have said here, and I think that for tackling any issue, you cannot start to fix a problem until you have measured what the problem is, right? You don't know what is happening. You don't know what problem you're trying to solve unless you measure the problem. And I'll just say that, Minnesota's transparency report was born out of a similar problem. There was a bill to remove Medicaid pharmacy from Medicaid managed care plans to do a carve out in order to try to protect rural pharmacies. When that happened, legislators were really shocked because instead of hearing from the Medicaid managed care plans, they heard from 340B hospitals, and they thought, "Why is that? What is that program? How is it related?" And so this transparency requirement was born out of like, well, you're bringing me all these numbers. I don't understand why there's this interaction here, so I'm going to make you report on it. And I think as people get to a breaking point around affordability, whether it's employers or it's individuals, people are really angry. People are upset. I didn't mention this. I'm the vice chair of the Minnesota Prescription Drug Affordability Board. I am not speaking in that capacity today, but I hear from people in Minnesota who are very frustrated because they cannot afford medicine. Their adherence is low. They have poor health implications because of that. As we get to this breaking point with patients who are very frustrated about affording care, policymakers are trying to take steps to alleviate those problems. I'm in a PDAB that's trying to affect this problem. Medicare maximum fair price, right? All of these new levers that policymakers are trying to pull are starting to interact with 340B. And so without transparency, we don't really have a way to gauge how big that interaction is and how big that problem is and how big of a pushback we're going to get, right? We just went through this drama over the rebate model. One of the things that I learned in my historical research is that there's a really clear reason why 340B was set up as an upfront discount. And that was because a lot of these Public Health Service Act clinics, and this is true to this day, do not have the administrative capacity to deal with a rebate. So giving them an upfront discount was an explicit choice to give them flexibility in order to continue to spending their resources on being core safety net providers. But of course, the primary beneficiaries of this program are not core safety net providers. And so, we had the rebate model that CMS put in place in order to really get the, pharmaceutical manufacturers to agree to do maximum fair price and make it feasible. And now that rebate program has been struck down, and I can only sort of see it potentially getting in the way of lowering costs for consumers. So transparency is necessary to name these problems.
Can I hop on what Saya said? So agree. I think, and I've been talking to some colleagues as we kind of think about what the future of 340B advocacy might hold for people who are concerned about program growth and distortions and all that stuff. And I think there is as on a lot of things, there's a debate about should we be focusing on beyond transparency, should we be focusing on sort of incremental reforms that would make the program better or less bad, less problematic, or should we just recognize that kind of the underlying way that 340B works is distorted and we have to like completely rethink it? And the policy analyst, the guy with a master of public policy, I don't have a PhD like the rest of you, um, would say we should just do the right thing and make a program that actually is meeting the needs of core safety net providers and not deal with a distorted program. But the guy who's been a lobbyist for most of his career says, yeah, but that's probably not going to happen today. So let's focus on the incremental reforms. I think some incremental reforms that are out there that frankly they will all get absolutely. I mean, the hospital industry will oppose anything we do. They're opposing transparency. Like they don't want people to know how much money they're making. So if they oppose transparency, they're going to oppose everything else. But a cognizant patient definition, again, that's a rabbit hole, but Neil sort of alluded to this. Once you've been tagged as a patient of a 340B covered entity, theoretically, you can be sort of tracked around wherever you go. It's almost like having a cookie on your phone. You get tracked around everywhere you go, and anytime you fill a drug, if it happens to be at a contract pharmacy for that covered entity, and there's lots of contract pharmacies for each one, that hospital gets that discount, right? Like that's stupid. That's dumb. It doesn't make any sense. And it also actually ends up crowding out a lot of times FQHCs. If you got a person who went to an FQHC and got a drug, the FQHC got the discount. They then go and see a doctor they were referred to at University of Minnesota Medical Center, and they got that drug. Now UM tries to capture that drug no matter what, even if you're getting most of your drugs through the FQHC, right? No. You get a drug, you get it from a 340B covered entity, you fill it at their pharmacy or their contract pharmacy, that's a 340B drug, fine. But if I then go to my private practice physician who has nothing to do with any FQHC or any hospital, why on earth are you getting a revenue off of that drug? It makes no sense at all. Like that's something that could be fixed and it's straightforward and it would piss some people off, but it would be a rational, reasonable thing to do. I think looking at, whether it's okay to have most contract pharmacies in high income areas, right? That's clearly an opportunity to drive revenue as opposed to extend access to low income people and underserved communities, right? Like that's something that could get done. But in the end, I think there is a solid argument that these sorts of incremental reforms just make a distorted program slightly less distorted. Um, and I think, there was a question in the chat, but do we need to start having a conversation about how do we make sure that the core safety net is getting the resources they need, probably funded by the pharmaceutical industry in some way, but it is being done in which the revenues are actually going to the right people, um, not New York Presbyterian, um, and it is not creating economic distortions across the healthcare system in which everybody, the PBMs, the covered entities, you name it, all are really making more money by prescribing and dispensing higher cost drugs.
The one
So
thing
we're
I'll
starting.
add to
Yeah,
that,
please
Sean,
go
just
on.
Brian, if I can, like an underappreciated fact is you're not just a 340B carrier for one entity. Like if you had that, you went to the FQHC and then you went to the hospital and then you went to this other hospital, then the question, and then you go to the contract pharmacy, like the average contract pharmacy has many, many covered entity relationships and vice
Right.
versa. And so now it becomes a competition of like, and Minnesota Report actually captures some of these dynamics too, of like if I'm that puts a lot of power into the hands of the TPA and the pharmacy to play the entities off each other. And I would argue that that's kind of bad news for the grantees in the sense that they're in the least, and the small hospitals. It's very hard to compete and to have any leverage against those contract pharmacies that you're trying to negotiate a deal with. So I don't know,
Can
Saya, you look
I?
like you're going to say something smarter
Oh,
than
because we cracked the seal on contract pharmacy, so I'm jumping in. So this issue here about what I've measured this actually in some of my own research. We call them conflicted prescriptions. So this point that Neil is making about, in theory, thanks to this lawsuit, this case, the Genesis case that had to do with HRSA's implicit criteria for, or actually explicit criteria for assessing patient, diversion. Um, there was a lawsuit. It has sort of like shook up how HRSA audits contract pharmacy. And because of this lawsuit, we now are in this world where, right, you could have one prescription being potentially claimed by multiple different covered entities for a discount. And I think this is going to create, a situation in which the bigger providers are even more likely to take some of those benefits from the providers that are less able to deal with this administratively. But I think it hits on another point that kind of gets to both what Neil has said and what Sean has said, which is that 340B, given that it was meant to be this teeny tiny little program, I think we found that CBO estimated at some point in its early state it was supposed to be cost around $30 million, something like that. It's a house built on sand that is shifting. So a lot of the guidance or regulations that have been promulgated by HRSA tend to fall down at some point. And, I'm not a lawyer. I can't really speak to why that is the case. But even contract pharmacy, the words contract pharmacy never appear in the actual legislation creating 340B. It was something that HRSA created because there were some of these small, Public Health Service Act clinics that didn't have pharmacies. And so they wanted to contract with a pharmacy. And then we get a demonstration project that HRSA created to allow, covered entities to have relationships with multiple pharmacies. The reason for that wasn't driven necessarily by the need of those Public Health Service Act clinics. It was, as far as we can tell, driven by the needs of the pharmacies that were like, well, we don't contract on a pharmacy by pharmacy basis. We contract at a region level. So maybe we should just make these contracts with more pharmacies. And then we get the ACA, and that kind of exploded. And then you could have as many contracts as you want. So we have these program features that today are seen as like core tenets of the 340B program that sometimes don't even show up in the original legislation, or the statutory language, and so they're subject to, they can be chipped away at by lawsuits, it's on shifting sands. It makes it difficult. The other thing that I want to say, I want to highlight GAO's work on contract pharmacy, because like in Sean's case, where a patient is, covered by employer sponsored insurance and they're going to fill this prescription, it's not necessarily the case that we can assume that that person who has employer sponsored insurance can actually afford that drug, right? Deductibles are going up, and patients face like list prices before the deductible is met. And in that case, this patient may be choosing to forego paying rent, make a car payment. They may be, skimping on food. There's all kinds of things that the data tells us that people do when they can't afford medicines. Why isn't that patient getting a discount? And GAO found that in most cases, those contracts do not extend any type of, charitable policy to the patient at the point of sale because it's off the hospital's campus. So I wanted to highlight that as well, because it poses an affordability challenge for patients.
Yeah, Saya, somebody asked me, like, what's the most obvious reform to make to this like sprawling program? And that was what I was alluding to earlier. It's like, at a minimum, it should be patient shows up, they're flagged as 340B, like discounts
Negotiate it
got to,
down. Say,
yeah,
I
I mean,
can't pay
discounts got
this.
to go to the patient. And
Yeah.
then that simple idea would allow Sean and his members and everybody else to kind of sort through, just like assess where things are. And then after that, you can figure out how do you, like, what is the size of the nut that needs to be provided to these little rural hospitals and the struggling FQHCs that serve these patients with affordability problems, and make sure that they're supported, not in a way that they've got to run on a treadmill and compete and go negotiate with CVS and, all these other things, but in a way that just makes them a more sustainable, deliverer of care without, like, depending for their lives on this crazy program. Um, and then the bigger hospitals, like that's clearly just a profit center for them, and that thing that they may lose in such an arrangement, and the more of the gains and more of the spending might go to the little hospitals and the FQHCs, which are supposed to be protected in this program.
So I'm going to pause for a moment. We are running towards the end here. We're not there yet, but if you have a question, we are now in the speak now or forever hold your peace phase of the conversation. Um, but I think we've gotten a couple questions on this, and Neil, I think you kind of hit on this. But I think one of the broader questions, and I don't know if this is somewhere between blowing the whole thing up and the incremental reforms that Sean is so skeptical of. But do we need to rethink what kind of entities are eligible? Is that a step we can take? And transparency was the easy one. Is there another kind of half step that gets us closer to, or is it simply a matter of putting the patients at the middle of it and worrying a little bit less about which providers are in bounds and out of bounds?
Yeah, Brian, I think it's a great point. What Saya was saying earlier about like two hospitals, I didn't know that about the 11.75% threshold being engineered to make sure two hospitals got in there. But, the majority of certainly the majority of not-for-profit hospitals are in 340B. So it's like if everybody's above average, everybody can't have an above average level of need to be supported in this program. So I would 100% agree that eligibility should be linked to a need and then should be dependent on filling that need in some measured, transparent way. And I think it goes in the broader bucket of hospital, not-for-profit, transparency. And there are a lot of hospitals. Everybody wants a great hospital near their house. I mean, we all love hospitals, but we also have to be mindful of the resource utilization. And there's no doubt that looking at the eligibility right now, because it's a cliff, it's really easy to game. If you draw the chart of dish percentage, boy, oh boy, is there a steep drop off at 11.76%. So something's going on. And I should really refresh that, but it's a crazy chart. And it just shows you that, of course, like if you have a barn and there's horses in the barn and then you open the door to the barn, guess what the horses are going to do? They're just going to go running. And it's not their force, like they're a horse, like that's what they do. So I think 100% that should be tightened up. And then I think the patient piece really needs to be much more transparent. Those are to me the two areas.
So can I add something here? One of the things that we discovered in our work on the history of the program is that people have sort of forgotten about part of the statute that defines eligibility for nonprofit hospitals. It's not just that you have a dish payment greater than 11.75%. It is also that you have a contract with state or local government to provide indigent care services. And what it appears has happened, and I had some students researching this, we tried to pull these contracts for hospitals in Minnesota, and we couldn't find them. So if you're a public hospital, you already have an obligation to provide services to patients, regardless of cost. But other nonprofit hospitals are supposed to have these contracts. And it appears what these contracts have become over time is simple just attestations of how much community benefit is provided by the hospital, and with nothing more. And so what transparency has done here in our own market is it's alerted local policymakers to what they're leaving on the table by signing one of these what they call MOUs. They're essentially giving up something that they should be getting, which is a real lift in assisting their safety net hospital and providing care. I actually think that a great reform here might be to tighten up that contract requirement and say, if you're a nonprofit hospital with a dish patient percentage of 11.75 or greater, wonderful, welcome. You must adopt really similar criteria to what FQHCs and public hospitals have in terms of their free and discounted policies.
Can I add one more
One more. Yep.
briefly? Um, the Another reform that would at least take away some of the perverse behavior by hospitals. I think you should raise the dish percentage. I mean, I think that's sort of obvious, but I also think it'll be impossible to do. Is to limit the amount by which hospitals are able to mark up the price of drugs. We saw this in Vermont. The state of Vermont has a Green Mountain Health Board. They looked and they realized they had the largest drug price markups in the country by hospitals. And most of the markups were happening at the University of Vermont Medical Center, a 340B hospital. The small rural hospitals, the little community hospitals, their drug price markups weren't that much because they don't have that much market clout. But University of Vermont had huge market clout. They were marking up the price of a cancer drug by 7,000%, 7,000%. The state actually stepped in and said, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And so now they have to price their drugs at, I think it's 100, they cannot mark them up to commercial insurers by more than, I think, 100% of acquisition price or maybe ASP. That's gameable, but 120% is a lot better than 7,000%. So I think sort of saying like, look, we get that 340B is used as a price arbitrage program, but we're going to limit how much you're allowed to arbitrage, saves people a lot of money, saves employers a lot of money, and it means that the program is no longer quite as big a cash machine as you might otherwise see.
So we're nearing the top of the hour. So there's one question in the Q&A, which is not simple, but it's important. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A that unfortunately we're not going to get to, and that's extra unfortunate because many of them would take 3 or 4 days of solid conversations between these three. But I want to deal with one that I think is just evocative and a good place to leave things. And this was a graduate student asking, what kind of research would add value to this conversation? Are there questions about 340B that are unanswered, or is this mostly about finding the political will or educational resources to make clear what needs to happen? What are the unknowns?
I have two suggestions. One is, not, I'm an economist and we all love to do sexy econometric work. Neither of these things really are that. But one is distributional. We need to understand for a menu of policies, if one were to change eligibility criteria or any of the things that we've talked about, right? what would be the distributional implications? Who would lose and who would gain? That unfortunately is hard to publish. I've had years of struggling to get work out on 340B because people don't often understand the value, but I do think that is incredibly valuable. I also think we need more qualitative work. There are, all kinds of, there's contractual language in contract pharmacy rules. There's stuff that's coming from Apexis, right? What did the contracts look like there? There's all kinds of, legal and qualitative research that needs to be done here that I think would really help make it clearer for policymakers why something that seems like a slam dunk is not a slam dunk.
Yeah, I would say if I were a graduate, I wake up in the middle of the night like 3 times a week with like some other 340B crazy idea that ought to be done. So there's a lot of ideas, and a good advice to grad students is to reach out, not in a, like to people like Saya and myself who publish research in this area. We'll both be happy to talk to you about ideas so I would just say, reach out to the people that are publishing in the space and we can have a nice conversation about unmet need in the area.
I'll add one more that I think will be unpopular with some of the audience. As we said, we've tried to calculate like what is the impact on employers, what is the impact on manufacturers, what is the impact on patients, I I think there's already some research in the space, but I don't know if there's any that's specifically on 340B, which is how does 340B affect manufacturer drug pricing behavior themselves,
Mm.
right? Manufacturers have there's so many incentives that drive toward higher list prices and higher launch prices, right? And I've talked to, and I'm not an academic, but I've talked to plenty of drug makers, and I sort of say, like, how do you decide? Like, you're deciding on these sort of crazy high prices. Like, what's the math that goes into that? And said, actually, there's a lot of math that goes into it because we have to look and say, all right, sort of obviously, what is the market? What will the market bear? What are the competitors? But then we've got to look at like, all right, we're going to be subject to the IRA at some point, and we are going to have to offer rebates at some point, if not immediately, and we're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to do that. And so increasingly, it's sort of driving up list prices in a way that everybody knows are too high. Even the drug makers would admit privately are too high because they know that that's not the real price. It's all going to be sort of brought down from here. So I would love to see like to what extent are drug prices themselves being driven, just the list price being driven up by 340B. If you're going into a market where you know you're going to experience a very large 340B discount, what does that mean for the list prices, and how does it have sort of downstream impacts across the industry?
Yeah, and it's hard to do that math, but I will say some of the manufacturers have been more open, and I think J&J is one of them, and I've seen a couple of others where they're basically saying, hey, here's how much of my gross to net is actually being driven by 340B. And it's the biggest line item by far is 340B. So to your point, that's nobody's idea of a good time. But it is what's happening. And I think more transparency on both sides of that would be welcome.
And if I were a graduate student, I would be very interested in collaborating with a young professor at whatever my law school is. The legal implications here, I think, are really fascinating, and you see a lot of cross-functional health policy work between the economists and the lawyers. In 340B, despite all of the litigation, which is well outside of the focus here, there is not a great legal literature on some of that. And so there's an opportunity there, I think, to blend some of this traditional public policy or economics with the legal piece of that. I'm going to take this opportunity. Seems like a good stopping point. We've obviously got a lot more to discuss. The good news is these three people are out there. They're publishing. This is not the only webinar. This is not the only event they're going to do. So by all means, keep an eye on all three of them. I appreciate everyone's patience, and again, really appreciate Reuters Events for putting such a great package together for us. So if you're in the United States, have a great long weekend. If you're not in the United States, be thankful that you don't have to deal with 340B directly.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for moderating.
Thanks so much.
This was
Take care.
wonderful.
Bye, guys.
Bye.